Monseigneur, Mr. President of the European Council, Monsieur le Premier Ministre de Belgique, Mr. President of Business Europe, Monsieur le Président de la Fédération des entreprises de Belgique, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored by the invitation of Business Europe and FEB to speak at this important conference. Our topic in this opening session is how can skills get Europe out of the crisis? I will take the liberty to interpret the word skills in two different ways. One is the more obvious and pertinent to this conference, namely professional skills. The second, slightly more daring, but I believe ultimately even more important, is in the sense of how can policy skills get Europe out of the crisis, because I believe that is the factor which is in shortest supply at the moment, in spite of so many good individual and collective efforts. Professional skills at all levels of professional and labor qualifications are of course crucial, and I believe that the emphasis to make things extremely simple, they are not, but in my way of presenting them, I would say that now Europe needs policies for the increase of potential growth, needs to continue to avoid policies that would only in an ephemeral way give the impression of contributing to growth, and has to try and achieve policies that would enable the growth generated by structural reforms. So, number one, potential growth needs to rely on structural reforms in each of our countries. The objective of structural reforms is precisely to increase the growth potential of our countries. I speak here on behalf of the country, Italy, that in the last 12 or 15 years only had half the growth rate enjoyed on average by the rest of the Eurozone. And that because of a low growth potential. And the reforms like the labor market reforms, like the liberalization, opening up to competition, especially in the services sector, and other reforms are precisely intended to and the speeding up of infrastructures are precisely meant to increase the potential growth rate over the medium term. These are the policies to be mostly focused upon, and I believe that this needs to be done both at the EU level and at the national level. And the pendant, the counterpart at the domestic level of the single market is to really make of our individual economies more of a market economy, opening up not only vis-à-vis the rest of the EU in terms of single market integration, but also removing various obstacles, various restrictions of entry, various forms of corporatisms which create rents and privileges and which normally play against the excluded, against the young, and in favor of the included, of the incumbents, normally the less dynamic elements of society and an economy. So these are, I believe, the policies, broadly sketched, on which Europe at the EU and at the national level has to work more, structural reforms. And then there are policies to be avoided because they would be an illusionary shortcut to growth, and these are, in my view, the purely demand-side policies of an old-style Keynesian way of looking at the world through expansion of budgetary deficits and all that. This would run against the recently embedded discipline of the fiscal compact and would produce no good on the medium-term basis for the European economy or for the national economies, I believe. And all the efforts that each of our countries is putting into budgetary consolidation, and Italy is among the countries which are deploying huge political, economic and social efforts to this purpose, with the aim of achieving budgetary balance already in 2013, which will mean a primary surplus net of interest payments of 5% of GDP. All this means that we reject the old-style policy of purely intentional growth through deficit-generated demand growth. But, number three and last, structural reforms, yes. Ephemeral deficit spending, no. But then we must not neglect that structural reforms per se will never deliver growth. Because if a country becomes more productive and competitive, but there is no demand for its product domestically or around it, growth will not materialize. And in fact, all the structural reforms and budgetary consolidation measures that we are now putting in place, if anything, are deflationary, not creating growth. So we need demand to be there. This means, I believe, that we have to cater for categories of expenditure that are at the same time creating demand today, but also generating an expansion of supply tomorrow, which is not the case for example, for government consumption expenditure, but which is the case for well-defined cross-border or domestic projects of infrastructures and investment, be it private, public and private, or public. Public investment is not necessarily worse for the European economy than private consumption, although the present framework of policy treats it in this way. So I believe that now that we have rightly an appeal coming up more strongly than 1 or 2 years ago for growth, we should not put into question the fiscal compact and the other weaponry for budgetary discipline, but we should also act to avoid that in 2 or 3 years those budgetary discipline instruments go through the unglorious end that was the case for the Stability Pact in 2003. So we must look forward to other growth-creating policy instruments and actions, and here both as regards the increase of capital of the European investment banks, as regards cross-border infrastructures, as regards a more appropriate treatment of genuine public investment in the national accounts, and all that, I believe, we need to consider that with an open mind, not as a way of eluding the budgetary discipline, but as a way to make budgetary discipline really sustainable in the medium term and really enforced, because it will be in a context of growth and not in a context of depression. The last word is about the efforts of Italy. You might have noted that Italy is deeply committed with a government which is somewhat untypical, but also untypical in the very positive sense of being supported by 3 large political groups in parliament which in the past hardly were talking to each other. And this government is working for budgetary discipline, for structural reforms at home. So we welcome the greater accent now given by others to the growth objectives in the EU's policy agenda, and we believe that we should altogether work very fast to have a strategic framework to have growth without conflicting with the good working of budgetary discipline that has been, through the initial impulsion of Germany, a recent very appropriate acquisition for the whole of the European Union. Thank you very much for your attention.